This is Mike Tatarsky, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City with a new episode. When Vietnam manages to get attention from international media, it's often presented as something of a pawn in the great power rivalry between China and the United States. Western corporations, as the narrative goes, want to decouple or de-risk, choose your phrase, from an ascendant, combative China, while Washington, D.C. views Vietnam as a key potential swing state in geopolitical hotspots like the South China Sea and potentially even the Taiwan Strait. The reality, of course, is far more nuanced. Vietnam is its own country. It has its own agency and motivations across defense, economic, and diplomatic issues. And policymakers here certainly do not view their options as a binary between China and the U.S. It's true that Vietnam upgraded relations with the U.S., Australia, and Japan over the last year, but ties with China remain tight, and they have to, given China's sheer economic military heft and geographic proximity. Vietnam's leadership has also pursued closer ties with many countries outside of this China-U.S.-led binary as well, a policy that could be put in simple terms, something like being friends with everyone but allies with no one. Given that context, how should we view Vietnam's positioning in current global geopolitics? Today's guest is Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran, author of the excellent ASEAN Wonk newsletter, a fellow at the Wilson Center, a senior columnist at The Diplomat, and an instructor at institutions including the State Department and the Department of Defense. Though based in D.C., Prashanth is from Southeast Asia originally and frequently visits the region to get the temperature of government officials and other decision makers. His expertise is impressively broad and deep, and I highly recommend his newsletter, which I'll include a link to in the show notes. We discussed Vietnam's bamboo diplomacy and deft balancing of China and the U.S., its role in broader Southeast Asia as countries like the Philippines confront China, while those such as Cambodia, for example, draw closer, the delicate dance of territorial claims and naval might in the South China Sea, or the East Sea, as it's known here in Vietnam, economic balancing in cutting-edge sectors such as semiconductors and green energy, and what may be on the Vietnamese government's mind as the U.S. heads into yet another divisive election season. Let's get to the conversation. Prashanth, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Great to be on the show. Thank you, Mike.
So yeah, we'll go ahead and jump right in. So one of the big headlines coming out of last year was, it wrote itself. It was a gift for reporters and editors, was that Vietnam was the only country that both President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping visited in 2023. That's undeniably a pretty remarkable fact, I suppose. Of course, Biden, readers and listeners will probably be familiar with this, visited to cement the comprehensive strategic partnership upgrade for the U.S., which was widely hailed both here and I think especially in D.C. or over on the U.S. side. But then Xi Jinping visited a month or two later. Chinese high-level visits back and forth between Vietnam have kind of continued. Vuong Dinh Hue, the National Assembly chairman, was just in Beijing a week or so ago. Yeah, and Vietnam has made it abundantly clear that China is still an extremely important partner. So where do you see these visits kind of situated within Vietnam's bamboo diplomacy? And also, for those who may not be familiar, what is bamboo diplomacy?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So I happened to be in Hanoi right after she had visited, and talking to Vietnamese diplomats and officials and scholars. I actually did not get the sense that they were very enthusiastic and happy with all of these developments. As you pointed out a little bit in your question, Vietnam has a long tradition of sort of balancing different relationships. Partly a part of its history. It's got, China right there as a neighbor. So you can't really sort of be something like the Philippines, for example, right? It's going out and sort of balancing. Vietnam's not an ally of the United States. It's, had wars with China, wars with the U.S., tensions with Russia previously as well. So it's partly a tradition of that. I think the other aspect of that as well is that, Vietnam has, as part of this bamboo diplomacy that you talked about, this very, sort of long tradition of balancing, hedging, whatever you want to call it, between different powers, right? And that the notion is, the metaphor of the bamboo, which is, it can bend sort of with the wind, with sort of different issues and impacts that come in, but it doesn't really break, right? So that's the notion of bamboo diplomacy. The issue is that this is a very challenging global and regional environment to be advancing that notion of bamboo diplomacy, right? You've got trade tensions, you've got U.S.-China competition, and frankly, you've got other Southeast Asian countries who are looking to do exactly the same thing, right? So that is really the big challenge. So the context of the visits last year for both the U.S. and China, I think it's safe to say for the U.S. it was a bigger deal because it was a double upgrade of a relationship to the highest tier that Vietnam has. They have this very sort of hierarchic sense of their diplomatic relationships. China and Russia have always been there because they're traditional partners, but they've been gradually expanding that to include other countries. They included South Korea, they included India, and so now the United States is in that tier. I think the sense I got from Vietnamese officials and diplomats is that, I think there's still a lot of sort of concern about, you've got these two relationships, but how are you actually going to move forward with the follow through, right? Particularly with the United States, they've actually agreed on a lot of ambitious things, things like semiconductors, for example, even some security things that they haven't really announced, publicly too much. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen, but the worry is going to be on implementation, right? I mean, China obviously is upset every time something big happens. You've got an election here in the United States in November. And then on the China side, the Vietnamese have been dealing for centuries with the perennial dilemma of how do you engage and balance China at the same time. So I think the proof is really going to be, coming in the next year, perhaps, about how we're going to see implementation on that. Because there's a lot of rhetoric, and you've got to balance that against the reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned a couple of things. We'll get to semiconductors, for example, later on. But you also mentioned the Philippines, which has, correct me if I'm wrong, but a full treaty with the U.S. And I think the U.S. is expanding or hopes to at least expand its military presence there. Of course, there's its own long, complicated history with the Philippines. And then Japan, which is not part of Southeast Asia, of course, but is linked. They just had this trilateral summit in the U.S. with President Biden. So these three countries seemingly pulling closer together. And of course, the Philippines is currently the most outspoken, I suppose, against China's actions in the South China Sea, or the East Sea here in Vietnam, with kind of direct confrontations, Chinese ships using water cannon and things like that. So genuinely quite tense situation there. Where do you see, of course, as you said, Vietnam is not an ally of the U.S. It's not an ally of China. It's not an ally of anybody, I guess, technically, on paper. But where do you see Vietnam's role or positioning in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you correctly said, Vietnam, doesn't like to be thought of as really being pro anybody or against anybody, right? If anything, Vietnam is going to be pro Vietnam, right? Yeah. And that's, going to sort of always be the case. I think in this kind of atmosphere of kind of U.S.-China competition, what you're seeing really is the United States kind of doubling down on what they call sort of like-minded allies and partners. So the U.S. has two treaty allies in Southeast Asia, Thailand and the Philippines. And they also have this network of partners that they acknowledge that they're not going to be allies, but they still want to build good relations with them, right? So countries like Indonesia, Vietnam is one of those countries as well. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have China, which is looking to exert its influence. Initially, you can just kind of feel that influence most sort of clearly and strongly in places like Cambodia and Laos. But frankly, that also affects Vietnam's neighborhood as well. So that's going to concern Vietnam for its own sake. And so you do have this kind of competition here between two areas. I think the risk, though, is that for some U.S. policymakers in Washington, not all of them, and I would say I would distinguish them from people who know a lot more about Vietnam, people who are on the ground. I think there is this tendency to see Vietnam as kind of the swing state in U.S.-China competition. So if the United States does X, Y, and Z, Vietnam's going to swing in the direction of the United States. I've always found that to be a little bit too simplistic of a characterization because I think, it's more useful, I think, to think about these Southeast Asian countries as making multiple choices every day in their relationships and different industries, different sectors, different issues. And so if you're the United States or you're China, what you want to do is to basically get enough leverage to push Vietnam's small choices, more of them in your direction and less in the direction of the other country. But you have to concede that on some issues, the other country is going to have an advantage relative to you, right? And so I think that's a more a more granular way of understanding that. But I think sometimes there are these very simplistic characterizations. The other thing I would say is I also don't think it's very useful to think about Vietnam as kind of the unitary actor, right, as any of these Southeast Asian states. I think sometimes there's a temptation to say this is a one-party communist state, so what a couple of leaders say goes. But if you look at Vietnam in these relations with major powers, I mean, look at the U.S. I mean, the Vietnamese Communist Party, the Chinese like to play up sometimes the notion that they have these communist solidarity and stuff like that. But if you look at the Vietnamese people, you look at opinion polls over the last few years, the Philippines is always ranked nearly number one in terms of, in the 90s, sometimes mid-90s. But Vietnam is ranked number two usually. So late 80s, early 90s in terms of, popularity of the United States. And that's pretty striking if you think about the Vietnam War, just happening, just a few decades ago. So I would say, it really depends on what issues you're talking about and what actors you're talking about in Vietnam. I mean, same thing, the bureaucracies. If you're advocating for trade and investment, or you're advocating for foreign policy, or you're advocating for health, you might turn to different actors. It might be U.S., might be China, might be Japan, might be South Korea, might be Australia. So it's a much more sophisticated, complex game, as kind of you indicated there in the question. And of course, for Vietnam, it's more complicated than the Philippines because, as you pointed out, the Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States. So that means that if something happens to the Philippines in the South China Sea, the United States is obligated, and it's said that it's obligated to come to the defense of the Philippines. Vietnam doesn't have that status. So if something happens to Vietnam, the United States is not going to come in and swoop in and sort of save the day. So Vietnam's got to make its own calculations there that are very separate from the Philippines.
Yeah, and I really like your point about, taking Vietnam kind of as a whole. And I'm trying to be cognizant of this conversation. Within this conversation, even as like Vietnam is not just kind of a pawn between China and the U.S. It has its own agency, its own motivations. And so, yeah, it does get a bit frustrating sometimes when you see kind of this simplified, what's the word I'm thinking of? Like they have two choices. They can either be with China or with the U.S. and there's nothing in between. Binary. Thank you. Gosh, too early, I guess. Yeah. And then, I mean, within the South China Sea, this is not really my area of expertise, but it seems like things there between Vietnam and China are relatively stable at the moment. I mean, I know there's every now and then a small flare. I think last year, a couple Vietnamese fishermen got injured by Chinese water cannon. So there's certainly, some harassment going on. It's rarely reported here, I will say. But do you think, because things are pretty tense again between China and the Philippines, do you think China and Vietnam are kind of consciously like, let's keep things a little calm, like, because we don't need like two really tense situations going on?
I think usually what you see in the situation is kind of the sort of a series of ebbs and flows, right? So you'll see periods of tension, and then you'll see periods of calm, and then also, as you pointed out, in the South China Sea, you have 4 Southeast Asian claimants, right? The Philippines, Vietnam, and then you have Malaysia and Brunei. And Indonesia, it does have disputes with China, but doesn't formally consider itself a claimant. But for all intents and purposes, the Indonesians are part of this dynamic as well. And so each of these countries have different stakes. Each of them have different ways of dealing with the situation. Right now, as I think you correctly pointed out, the focus is really on the Philippines. And, China is, very upset. It's made this very clear publicly that, the Filipinos are, making trouble, going to Washington with the Japanese and sort of having this trilateral arrangement. And so a lot of Chinese efforts have been directed at the Philippines. And that creates a little bit of a dynamic because, the Philippines looks around at other Southeast Asian countries and says, well, if it's being directed solely at us or mostly at us, well, why won't you guys kind of help us, right? And sort of why can't we just band together? And it seems like a very kind of simplistic solution. But as I said, Vietnam is very different from the Philippines, and it's the same thing with the Malaysians, the Bruneians, and the Indonesians. No other country is a treaty ally of the United States. And if you go back decades, depending on who you talk to and what perspective you adopt, if you speak to Vietnamese officials, they'll be telling you when Vietnam was talking about the South China Sea in the 1970s and the 1980s, other countries in Southeast Asia were not really paying as much attention to what was happening to Vietnam, and the Chinese were doing all kinds of things to Vietnam, right? And that time, Vietnam was outside of ASEAN. It wasn't really a full member. It only joined ASEAN after the Cold War. So this whole dynamic that we have of these Southeast Asian countries trying to manage this competition, these are dynamics that have, they're decades old, and each country kind of has different stakes and sort of dynamics. I also think, for the Chinese, they usually have different leverage points for Southeast Asian countries and different cards that they play at different points, right? So it might not be the South China Sea today, but it might be the South China Sea tomorrow. Today it might be, concerns about diplomatic activity, it might be concerns about trade, and so on and so forth. So it's only one of several issues there that the Chinese are managing. That said, I do want to emphasize, I said that these countries have different stakes. You have seen movements like, President Marcos was in Vietnam earlier this year. Both countries met. They held a series of consultations. They did a couple of agreements in the maritime domain. But again, the problem in Southeast Asia that you often find is that it's really hard for these countries to come together on these issues because they have their own equities, but also they have much bigger relationships with China sometimes than they do with each other, right? So, for example, when President Marcos was in Vietnam, one of the goals was let's increase the amount of trade between the Philippines and Vietnam. But if you look at the actual amount of trade, you're talking about increasing it to, say, 10 billion. China's trade with Vietnam is approaching 200 billion, right? So you're not really going to get that kind of sort of diversification. The stakes are just too high for these countries. And China, in terms of its Coast Guard capabilities and its naval capabilities, it outpaces all of the countries in Southeast Asia combined. And Vietnam is, by far, if you look at the four claimants, they're the most capable of those claimants. Mm-hmm. And even Vietnam, as we saw in the oil rig incident in 2014, it's got challenges whenever China tries to be assertive in the South China Sea. So it needs to be careful.
Yeah. And speaking of the defense capabilities, there was some Reuters reporting a few weeks ago about how, Vietnam's defense new arms deals last year, 2023, were the lowest since, 2019 or something along those lines, which, I'm not saying I don't think all countries need more weapons, but when China is rapidly building up to take on a country, a military as strong as the US, for example, surely that's in the back of their minds here. And I also took note, speaking of Reuters, a couple of days ago, they reported that China's defense minister said that China wants to, or is willing to, bring their strategic mutual trust, I'm quoting here, between the two militaries, that's China and Vietnam, to a new level. I don't know if Vietnam has responded to that, but I also found that, I don't know, it could just be diplomatic speak, but I also found that interesting, given what's going on with the Philippines. What do you make of that sort of phrasing?
Yeah, I think there's always this kind of balance for China with its relationships with Southeast Asian countries, including Vietnam, where there's a component of pressure on particular issues or disputes, but then also there's still the engagement track that they keep live through different engagements and such. So you'll see this kind of rhetoric when things are seemingly going well or they want to sort of ease tensions. But then at other times, I recall a few years ago, the Chinese just cut off defense talks with the Vietnamese. And that, was a big concern because whenever you set up these, one of the things that you do in issues like the South China Sea to manage the situation is you want to establish diplomatic channels. You want to make sure that there are lines of communication that are open. But in several of cases where China has had disputes with countries in Southeast Asia, but also, other cases like the United States, these lines of communications are open, but they're not really utilized, or China just ignores them and kind of just does what it wants in places like the South China Sea, where, it does have a large asymmetry of power, right? So absent, countries building up their militaries, which you referenced earlier, or having external relationships with other countries to help balance against that. China feels like it's got a 9-dash line, which is this neat, or 10-dash line, depending on what you want to use, that they've drawn around, and they're going about enforcing it, and that's their line. And so it's going to be up to other countries to make sure that reality doesn't endure. But I do have to tell you, I mean, the last few years, talking to Vietnamese officials and diplomats, speaking to other countries in Southeast Asia that have stakes in the South China Sea, I think there's more worries than ever that the South China Sea is going to become something like a Chinese lake, effectively. And so there's a lot of concern about that. Really difficult, not a lot of good options there. There's a ASEAN code of conduct that's been in negotiation for decades that hasn't gone anywhere. I don't think people are hoping that that's going to resolve the situation. But absent, talking, you're really talking about conflict management. That's essentially where we're at.
Yeah. I mean, it's striking when you don't have to be a military expert when you see these photos of Chinese ships next to Filipino or Vietnamese ones, and the difference is striking. Also interesting.
Yeah, and I think.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I mean, I also wanted to emphasize that, we talk about this, the South China Sea. Sometimes it sounds very abstract. It sounds like a big geopolitical thing. But it also affects, livelihoods, right? It affects, fishing. It affects the environment. So you've had experiences in the past. I mentioned the oil rig incident where you had, a bunch of protests that were rocking Vietnam. You've had incidents where fishermen have been injured, and boats that have been rammed by Chinese vessels that say that they are, kind of normal fishing vessels or civilian vessels, but everybody knows that they're not, and they're often a lot bigger than the Southeast Asian ships or vessels. So I think this is an issue which, it touches a wide range of areas, the South China Sea question. And so I think even if we don't get resolution on the disputes themselves, there is a lot that we can do in terms of, what does it mean for fishing? What does it mean for the environment? What does it mean for oil and gas and energy exploration, which is also big for Vietnam, as it is for some of these other countries. So irrespective of whether you get these sovereignty issues resolved or not, I think if you can make ground on these other key functional areas, that's going to have benefits for, a lot of people individually, rather than just the militaries or the countries themselves.
Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned the 9-dash line as well. That almost seems like it's something that I know the Vietnamese government obviously hates that, but also the Vietnamese people have really taken it off as almost cause celeb, or maybe that's not the right phrase for it, but you have these instances where, especially last year, it had these almost bizarre interactions with pop culture. I mean, I think, I wrote about this in the newsletter, but like Barbie got banned here because of supposedly that I don't think it was actually in the movie, but that's how it went. And then there was a Blackpink, the big South Korean girls group. Their concert, they ended up performing in Hanoi, but there was a controversy in advance because the promotion company had it on their website. So it goes into all these bizarre, even pop culture intersections, which is quite fascinating. Anyway, so don't just want to focus on military and defense issues. I mean, you mentioned semiconductors at the start, which, as you said, when Biden visited, that was part of the fact sheet that the White House sent out after the fact. I will note it was kind of noteworthy that it didn't include really any like hard, high profile investment. But talk is important, of course, and certainly the Vietnamese government in the months since has clearly identified this as like, we want this industry as kind of our next step up the ladder of manufacturing, trying to move away from, footwear and apparel and the sorts of things that have been, not that there's anything wrong with those industries, but that's not how you're going to get to a high value economy. So, and that's also a huge part of the US-China relationship right now, with, the US trying to restrict Chinese access to the most advanced chips and China trying to build its own industry. I think they're restricting Intel chips and government phones and computers and things like that. Anyway, so again, at the risk of just positioning Vietnam between these two superpowers, how do you see this kind of playing out in semiconductors and maybe the broader economic realm?
Yeah, I mean, I think the semiconductors point is probably where you see this kind of sectoral competition that you have in Southeast Asia, right? And broader Indo-Pacific about, Semiconductors is one. There's, critical minerals is kind of another one. You've got electric vehicles. You've got climate, renewable energy. There are these kind of buckets where you have all these Southeast Asian countries trying to do more in that space and attract more investment. The challenge, as you correctly pointed out in the question, is, you need investment. You also need, there's a lot of talk about, how much money you put down, how many fabs can you buy, factories, and so on and so forth. The big thing about semiconductors is that you need a lot of talent for that too, right? And so the Vietnamese have had, in terms of their planning, thousands and thousands of people that they need to put into work for the next, 10, 15 years if they are to realize these big ambitions. And so the U.S. is part of that story in terms of kind of helping Vietnam figure that out. But the Taiwanese also are big there as well. They've been doing a lot with Southeast Asian countries in terms of trying to encourage this. They've got their own interests, obviously, because the Taiwanese they're where a lot of the chips are concentrated, right? And if you have a Taiwan scenario, it's kind of important. I think sometimes for viewers and listeners, sometimes there is a sense that the Taiwan scenario is very different from the South China Sea. It's very different from these other conflicts. But actually, if you look at it, the biggest feature that is occupied in the South China Sea is by the Taiwanese right now. It's called Itu Aba. So if there is a actual confrontation between China and Taiwan, and there is a scenario that involves the South China Sea and the kind of future of this feature and how that affects other claimants as well. So there is that point as well that has a security dynamic or mechanism in place that you have to kind of consider. The other thing that I think is really important with respect to semiconductors is kind of looking at, who are the key players and where they fit in Vietnam's kind of foreign investment landscape, right? So if you look at the foreign investment data from the last 2 months that just came out by the government, they put out, so it looks pretty rosy. The statistics are that it's about 30+% increase from the investment figures from last year. If you look at the countries that are part of that, yes, the U.S. is there, yes, China is there, but it's actually a very diversified portfolio that you don't find necessarily in a number of other Southeast Asian countries. So you've got Singapore that's part of that equation, and the Singaporeans are actually looking to do more in Vietnam. So a lot more interest in Singaporean businesses in doing more there. You've got the Japanese that are doing more with Vietnam. They've also upgraded the relationship. South Korea is also looking to do more. So it's a very kind of diversified investment landscape. The other aspect I think that we should consider, we've talked a lot about opportunities, is kind of the challenges, right? And I think when you talk about semiconductors, you talk about these big industries and foreign investment, as I think you've been writing and covering greatly in the newsletter, there's a lot of expectations, I think, from foreign investors that see this Vietnam growth story as being really attractive. And that's not anything to sort of disparage, because if you look at, the Asian Development Bank came out with their growth data for Southeast Asia and the rest of the world, the rest of the region, sorry. And Vietnam, along with the Philippines, rank as the top in terms of the largest growing economies in Southeast Asia at 6%. The average growth rate is under 4%. So if you're looking for opportunities in Southeast Asia, Vietnam is going to be right up there. The challenge is, as we've seen in the past year, you've had continued issues with, the anti-corruption issues in Vietnam, the kind of leadership issues that you've seen. You've seen electricity outages. So there's a lot of challenges that are happening. And you mentioned, climbing up the value chain and escaping the middle income trap. That is a big concern for a lot of Southeast Asian countries, and Vietnam is right there. It's very easy to talk about that. It's actually really hard to implement that, because you need to basically get out of your dependent sources of growth for a long time and get to new sources of growth. That's going to be very difficult, because it requires you to diversify. It requires a lot of, businesses that have a lot of stakes in the old industries to kind of give way to other businesses that have stakes in other industries. So there's a lot of power dynamics that are at play here that prevent this growth story from being a very linear one. But I think in terms of the trajectory of Vietnam's growth story, you couldn't really find a better case in Southeast Asia, which is why Vietnam, I think, gets a lot of focus, including in other countries in Southeast Asia, which keep saying, "Hey, look at Vietnam. We were Malaysia, looking to grow, or we were Thailand looking to grow as being one of the tiger economies in the 80s and the 90s. But now the Vietnamese were starting their Doi Moi economic reforms in the 80s, and now they're, the kind of big growth story in Southeast Asia. So there is that effect as well, where what happens in Vietnam also stimulates competitive dynamics in the rest of Southeast Asia. That's really important.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't an episode about energy, but I think energy is like, it almost seems like it's turning into, or if not already, kind of the key determiner for a lot of this. I mean, of course, there's a lot of competition. Malaysia, for example, has a more established semiconductor industry already, so that's going to play some role there. But yeah, I mean, there's going to be shortages in the north again in the coming weeks. I think everyone is largely in agreement that next year will probably be more of the same. And yeah, if you're coming in with semiconductors, it's that those factories themselves consume a lot of power, and it has to be steady. You can't just have power shutting off. So that's going to be a big problem. I mean, of course, I want to try to be optimistic here, but I do have my skepticism about semiconductor, these ambitions at least. I mean, I thought it was a bit telling. There was this big U.S. business delegation 3 or 4 weeks ago, I think, something like 50 companies came here, none of which were in the semiconductor industry. And that, of course, that doesn't mean nobody is considering investing, but that was a bit telling, I thought.
Yeah, and I think your point on energy is really important as well, because the other kind of example of this is the Just Energy kind of transition partnership, right? That there are 2 in Southeast Asia, 1 in Vietnam, 1 in Indonesia, and the one in Vietnam, it's not moving as quickly as I think folks hoped it would. So it's this kind of shiny object, I think, that when countries get together and they look to do good work, understandably, in terms of promoting the energy transition, they're trying to make these inroads, but you run into a lot of issues that are primarily domestic. So if you're the U.S. or you're a member of the G7, you're trying to do something to help Vietnam. Part of it is what you can do externally, but there also matters what happens domestically as well. So, like for a while, actually, businesses in Vietnam, as you know, right, with all these issues with the anti-corruption issues. And lots of political wrangling, a lot of things had slowed down, including government approvals for major business decisions and so on and so forth. So with these businesses, you see interest, but you're right to flag that the real metric we need to be looking at is the actual numbers, like actual investment on the ground. That's actually translates into kind of factories or investments in labor, and so on and so forth. And if you don't have that, the issue for Vietnam, or the challenge for Vietnam, which I go back to again, is that China is this big, large economy that it's growing slower now, but the economic pull and the gravitational pull of the Chinese economy is huge for Vietnam. So unless you have other countries that are coming in to diversify that, you're going to get Vietnam increasingly being pulled into China's orbit. So that's why, the Vietnamese were probably among the most disappointed when they entered into the Trans-Pacific Partnership and then found that the United States, withdrew from that, because they were hoping, not only to enter into these agreements with other countries, but also have a lot more closer relationships with the United States in terms of trade and investment, and pull the United States into the region. So there's the economic imperatives that we talked about, but it's also a geopolitical question for these countries, because as China has shown in multiple instances, essentially, if you go economically closer to China, that may be good in the best of times, but in the worst of times, China will use that and can use that to leverage that to coerce you. And then you really have no other alternatives if you're not hedging your bets.
Yeah, and I mean, they've definitely shown that with Vietnam as well. I know, for example, that over the last couple of years, at various times, they can just stop accepting dragon fruit, or like kind of name your crop, your agricultural product. They can just say, we're not accepting this anymore. And then you're left with hundreds of trucks with rotting durian at the border, which I know if you're in the US, that might almost sound comical, but if you're a farmer, that's serious. I mean, that's your livelihood getting wiped out. And also on the economics and kind of speaking of the China orbit, I mean, another issue or another huge economic trend over the last few years has been this decoupling talk of, companies trying to, very few can fully leave China, but at least move some operations from there into countries like Vietnam. But then there's this other issue where a lot of inputs for all kinds of goods still come from China. I mean, I know I mentioned apparel and footwear earlier, but most cotton or fabric, for example, still comes from China. Vietnam doesn't make it. And then, of course, I really don't want to have to talk about U.S. politics too much, but as you mentioned, there's an election coming up in November. Everyone's well aware of that. But if, say, Trump were to be elected again, what kind of trade fear do you think there might be for Vietnam? Because he clearly doesn't really care very much about kind of the norms of international trade. And again, with these inputs still coming from China, like what do you think Vietnam might be thinking with that prospect?
Yeah, I think, if you sort of look at the various scenarios, Vietnam's kind of position in U.S.-China competition, I think there's one that you sort of mentioned earlier where I think, if you're very optimistic as a U.S. policymaker, maybe you hope that Vietnam will be moving closer to the U.S. orbit in the coming years. There's one where Vietnam gets pulled more towards China's orbit because its quest for diversification is more challenging, and China just is the gravitational pull of China just pulls Vietnam there. But I think those are two very kind of extreme scenarios. I think the scenario you're talking about, is one of it's a very complex and complicated one, which is even as we're talking about kind of diversification of supply chains, China plus one strategies by companies trying to move, from China to Vietnam, other countries in the region as well. The issue with that is that if you look at the data from the last few years, and actually the Peterson Institute has actually, done some good work on this. Contrary to the fact that we're talking about these kind of search for diversification, supply chains have actually gotten a little bit more concentrated towards countries like China in the Indo-Pacific, if you look at it over the last few years. And so we already are in that kind of position where the quest for diversification is kind of like you're swimming upstream almost against the current. And so that's going to be really difficult. And I think your point about inputs is also really important. So when you look at the countries and various institutions kind of monitor this very closely, including the U.S. government, there's been sort of restrictions placed by the United States on China and other entities that are operating, getting goods out of Xinjiang, right, for obvious reasons, human rights practices and violations and so on and so forth. But, the biggest place where they've moved from China is to Vietnam, right, which kind of tells you that when you talk about diversification, it's a very, very complex story. So if Vietnam's hope is that it's trying to move away in terms of its dependence on China and try to diversify, you're going to need to find a way to address the question of where these inputs are coming from, rather than just bringing in kind of more goods and labor and so on and so forth. And the way you do that is you diversify your sources of economic growth and you make sure that you're investing and you move up higher in terms of the economic ladder, right? And you make sure that you're doing that across all of the industries. The issue is that that's very difficult to do, right? I mean, you mentioned the defense industry earlier, and the fact that the Vietnamese, in terms of how much they're kind of importing in terms of arms, kind of goes up and down. The reality is, if you look at Vietnam's quest for diversification, it's been really hard for Vietnam to diversify away from, and the primary source of arms is still Russia. That's where the vast majority of it is coming from, including some of their high-end capabilities, like their submarines, are coming from Russia. So, you have this odd dynamic in Southeast Asia where it's like, okay, Vietnam has this position on the Russia-Ukraine war, but the reality is, if you're looking at countries in Southeast Asia that are actually doing something on deterrence and have the capabilities, you're going to need Vietnamese submarines as part of a deterrence campaign against China, right? You can talk about diversification, you can talk about Vietnam's position, but I think everyone recognizes the geopolitical realities of that. And also, frankly, if you talk to people who are familiar with the Vietnamese defense industry, there are relationships that are invested in trying to ensure that Vietnam continues to have those relationships with Russia, right? Rather than relationships with the United States. And so it's not necessarily just about strategic alignments and stuff. It's also about relationships. It's also about legacy, right? So diversification is often, a lot harder to do than it is to just kind of talk about. So I think you correctly pointed out an instance there on arms and defense sales, where I think the movement has been a lot slower than you see kind of in the headlines sometimes about, Vietnam's got this upgrade with the United States. They're going to buy all of these weapons, from Washington, right? That's just not going to happen. And also, frankly, there are other considerations like price.
Sure.
They're expensive, and also compatibility and interoperability, right? So you got to be thinking about all of these considerations and balancing them, not just diversification in the act.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't talk about Russia at all, really, but that has been another interesting area where I think a lot of people kind of simplify or misunderstand just how deep the Vietnamese relationship is and history is with Russia. I know I've talked to friends where it's like, well, why wouldn't they just support Ukraine? Like, there's parallels as a smaller country fighting an imperial huge power. There's some validity to that, but yeah, it's much more complicated. And I guess kind of moving towards a conclusion, I know predicting the future is impossible, but going back towards the start, over the last year, Vietnam upgraded with the US, Japan, Australia. Those are all unquestionably the West or Western aligned, at least in Japan's case. I'm sure there's some momentum in some policy circles and perhaps in DC, as you mentioned, where you are. What do you think is more, I don't know, like over the next couple of years? I know Vietnam will have its own leadership change in 2026, perhaps not as dramatic as potentially in the US, but where do you kind of see Vietnam trying to thread this needle? I think generally they're pretty sophisticated and savvy in how they do this, but what do you kind of potentially see coming?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my sort of trips to the region and, conversations with Vietnamese officials, diplomats, I think I'm most struck by, how cautious they are about these very kind of, overgeneralizations, as we talked about earlier in the episode about, Vietnam moving, closer to the US or, being sucked into the orbit, of China. I think it's a much more complex and complicated series of dynamics. And I think, frankly, what I'm most struck by is actually how much concern I hear about the balance of Vietnam's relationships between the external environment that's very challenging and the domestic challenges that Vietnam has that are also quite significant. And the huge whole host of reasons, but environmental management and degradation and climate, corruption, being a big challenge, the notion of needing to move up the value chain and the kind of technology ladder. These are huge, huge domestic challenges. And then you've got this challenging external environment to boot as well. So I think the big scenario that I think you see Vietnam moving closer towards is actually kind of avoiding these major extremes and trying to cultivate itself as an actor, which, going back to a point that you raised earlier, has a lot of agency. And I think I'm originally from Southeast Asia, right? So I grew up Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines. I've traveled to all the countries in the region, and I hear the same thing. Whenever you have this framing of U.S.-China competition, the instant reaction you get from these countries is an appreciation of their agency, firstly, and then secondly, just cautioning you that if you look at the actual data and their actual relationships, it is really not a binary game. I mean, this is not just diplomatic speak, but in the case of Vietnam, we've talked about how Japan has a big role, right? South Korea's got a big role.
Oh yeah,
They've got relationships with India, with Russia. So it's not just a talking point to say that it's not about U.S.-China competition. It really is a much more challenging and sort of a granular environment. And I would say just finally on the U.S., because you brought up Trump earlier, I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, because it might be, if you're a U.S. official, you want to say there's going to be continuity, don't worry. But, every Southeast Asian country that I go to and every official that I talk to is asking about what the future of the Trump administration is going to be if it happens. And I think for Vietnam, that's particularly striking because remember, under the Trump administration for Vietnam, it wasn't all bad because the Trump administration was tougher on China and gave a lot of backing to Southeast Asian countries on South China Sea. But there was also a lot of issues that they brought up, including, Vietnam. What are your links with North Korea? What are you doing on that front? What are you doing on bilateral trade with us, right? We want to sort of reverse that sort of balance on trade. So Vietnamese officials found themselves dealing with a lot of issues that in the Biden administration, you may be not seeing a lot of, because the Biden administration is trying to cultivate broader relationships with these countries. But who's to say under a second Trump administration that we might not see a reversion to that? But also, the second Trump administration could look very different from the first Trump administration in terms of who's serving in office, in terms of his general tendencies, which are very unpredictable. So you never really know. So a consistent thread that you see across Southeast Asia is countries that are, if to the extent that they're balancing or hedging or whatever you want to call it, one part of that is an assertive China, and we know that. But the other part is a more unpredictable United States. And so every administration, you kind of are wondering, okay, this is great. What's going to happen next year? Or what's going to happen next year? And I think a lot of that is up to U.S. officials to make sure that these countries are reassured that there's going to be a lot of continuity. And that's obviously going to be harder to do in some administrations than others.
Yeah. And I have to imagine, again, not to get too political, but that countries which would ostensibly hope for U.S. support at some point are looking at what's going on with the aid to Ukraine being held up and wondering, well, what? Okay. And I know Ukraine is halfway around the world from Vietnam, but it's very relevant.
Yeah, exactly. And as it's also, you're right to flag that, because the United States is, on the one hand, you have an administration that wants to do a lot more in Asia and focus on Asia and the Indo-Pacific. But on the other hand, you have global realities where the United States is finding itself in multiple wars that are not in Asia. Conflicts in the Middle East now that are, increasing as we're speaking, and also the, Russia's war in Ukraine and that kind of European architecture, and also global challenges, right? Economic challenges, climate challenges, and so on and so forth. So, it's a global sort of situation and arena, and countries are going to look around and raise questions, not just about what you're doing with them or with Asia, but your general foreign policy. And so it's going to be up to the United States and U.S. policymakers to make sure that they are advancing a narrative that is very comprehensive and inclusive.
Great point to end on. So Prashant, thank you so much for taking the time. I know there's
great to be with you.
We probably could have talked for hours, but I appreciate you bringing some nuance to very complex and complicated topics. So we'll all be keeping an eye on everything we talked about, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform, and be sure to share it with friends or colleagues who may be interested. Connect with the Vietnam Weekly on LinkedIn, Threads, or Instagram, and get in touch with me if you have any comments, feedback, or suggestions at matatarsky@gmail.com. Just a programming note, I'm taking a break for the Reunification Day International Labor Day holiday next Monday, so I'll see you in 2 weeks.